Hi, my name is Joy Axelson, and in this lecture for Amos, we will be looking at some BRI helps. So, in the last lecture, we had talked about some of the historical setting which you will use for your BRI. But remember the assignment that you did in 1st and 2nd Kings? This assignment is a great help for your BRI, for the prophets, especially for the background to the kings of Judah and Israel. It will also help you with knowing what was going on with the major world powers such as Assyria and Babylon. Again, you have a handout that was given to you at the introduction to the prophetic literature called The Great Empires for Kings and the Prophets from Lesson 2, and this will also help you with your prophetic BRIs. Now, I won't go over all the parts of the BRI, but just some things to help you with. So for the critical method, when was this book written? Well, we know that he prophesied during the time of Jeroboam I and Uzziah. And so that time frame is around 790 through 753 BC. It seems like it would have been most likely during the later time of Jeroboam II's reign, because that would have given the country time to become prosperous and lazy in their wealth. Amos chapter 1 verse 1 talks about an earthquake. So we see that Amos went to Israel to speak the prophecy, and then he wrote down the prophecy 2 years after the earthquake. Now you can say, which earthquake? Well, there is evidence of a sizable earthquake in the excavations at Hazar, which was located in northern Israel, which has been dated around 760 BC. And also in Zechariah chapter 14 verse 4 through 5 speaks of an earthquake during the time of Uzziah. And Zedekiah was written around 580, 400 BC. So this earthquake had to be significant enough during the time of Uzziah that was remembered about 250 years later. So it's possible that this book was written sometime around 758 BC to 753 BC. Now, whom was it written to? As you need to remember that you have two audiences in the prophets, just like you did with the historical books. You have those who are with the prophet, the people that the prophet is prophesying to during his time, either in Israel or Judah, the original hearers, the original audience. But then you have the original readers, who most likely would have been Judah. Now the reason for this is because Israel, after they were taken into exile by Assyria in 722 BC, they were scattered throughout the empire of Assyria. And you never see them coming back after exile. So it's most likely that all the prophets would have been written and kept by Judah. Now the prophet Amos spoke to Israel in Bethel. We see that mentioned in Amos chapter 7 verse 12 through 13. But the book of Amos would have been written to Judah, like I just talked about. Okay, when you look at the literary method, in some prophets you have both prose and poetry, but the majority of all the prophets are poetry. But remember to include that you have different types of oracles as well. Now for the historical method, you have the world powers, Israel, Judah's political situation, alliances, battles. These things you can find help from your king's assignment. The religious situation, though, going on in Israel and Judah, you can get some help from your king's assignment, but you can also really find a lot of information in the specific prophet book that you are studying through. So you can see what kind of sins are listed there to see what is their religious situation. Now the contemporary prophets for Amos would be Jonah, as we talked about in Kings, and it would be also Hosea. Now for the survey method, remember that the reason the book was written would relate to the original reader. Of course, it relates a bit to, like this book, why it was spoken would relate to Israel, but why it was written would be for Judah. Something new with this BRI also is that you need to look for the character of God in the books of the prophets. Many people believe that the prophets just talk about sin and judgment. But as you dive into these prophets, you will discover so much about God's character. And you will see so much of His faithfulness, of His desire to show mercy and love, His longing for a relationship with His people. But yet you also see His power, because God had to be faithful to the covenant, and He had to bring the covenant curses because of their sin, because the people broke the covenant, not God. But God's heart and longing was to bring restoration to the people of Israel.